All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling the world of UK policing. You know those legal documents and articles you sent in on police powers under UK constitutional law? Well, it's surprisingly fascinating stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about the balance between public safety and individual rights, which is, let's face it, always a bit of a hot topic.
Yeah, and it's not just about the laws written down somewhere, but also how those laws actually play out. How they affect that balance between keeping people safe, but also protecting their individual freedoms.
So where do we even begin unpacking something as complex as police powers? I mean, where does their authority even come from?
Well, it starts with their core duty, right?
Oh.
Protecting the public.
Right.
By detecting and preventing crime. And this isn't just some vague idea. This is rooted in both common law, which is built on centuries of court decisions,
Okay.
and also specific legislation like the Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
Ah, yeah, PACE.
PACE, exactly.
So it's a mix of tradition and very specific rules, creating this framework of what they can do,
Yeah.
but also what they can't do, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's that tension, I think, between giving the police the tools they need,
Yeah.
but also making sure that they don't overstep any boundaries. That tension, I think, is at the heart of everything we're discussing today.
So let's get into those boundaries then. You mentioned different categories of police powers. What are they? And can you give us like a real-world example of each?
Well, the sources break them down into three main areas, really. Investigating crime, preventing crime, and what they call disposing of cases.
Okay.
So picture this. A break-in happens.
Right.
Police need to investigate. They gather evidence, interview witnesses. That's them using their powers to investigate.
Okay.
Now imagine a rowdy party disturbing the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
The police might intervene, disperse the crowd, maybe issue warnings. That's preventing crime and maintaining order. And finally, picture someone shoplifting something small. The police might handle that with just a caution instead of a formal arrest.
Okay, yeah.
That's disposing of a case without going to court.
So even the decision of whether to go the formal route or not, that's part of their powers.
It is, yeah.
But all of this has to happen within certain limits, right? I mean, it can't just be a free-for-all.
Oh, absolutely not. These powers are very much restricted by human rights law and equality legislation.
Right.
A key framework here is the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR.
Right.
It outlines fundamental rights that everyone in the UK has, and the police can't just violate those even while they're doing their job.
So what happens then when someone's rights clash with the need for police action? I mean, how do we make sure things don't go too far?
That's where two really important concepts come into play, and that is legitimate purpose and proportionality. Now, legitimate purpose means that any action, that restricts someone's rights, it has to be for a valid reason, allowed by law. It can't just be based on personal bias. So an officer can't just search someone, say, just because they look suspicious.
Right.
There needs to be a specific legal justification.
So even if an officer has a hunch, it's not enough. There have to be actual concrete reasons.
Exactly. And that's where proportionality comes in. Any police action must be appropriate to the situation. So they can't use excessive force or intrude on someone's privacy more than is absolutely necessary. It's about using the least restrictive means possible to achieve their goal.
So it's kind of like a balancing act, trying to keep things safe, but also protect people's freedoms.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this balancing act is maintained through multiple layers of guidance and accountability.
Okay.
So first you've got the College of Policing.
Right.
They set the standards for officers and they issue what they call codes of practice.
Codes of practice. It sounds pretty official.
They are. Think of them as detailed instruction manuals on how to use those powers lawfully and ethically.
So are these like suggestions, or do officers actually have to follow them?
Oh, no, they're a legal requirement. Officers are obligated to follow these codes when they're carrying out their duties.
Okay.
And then on top of those codes, you have specific legislation, like what we call the PACE codes,
Right.
which provide even more detailed instructions on how to use powers under PACE.
Okay, hold on. More codes. How many are we talking about here?
Well, there are 8 PACE codes, each dealing with a different stage of police work. So, for instance, Code A covers stop and search. Code C focuses on detention. Code G outlines arrest procedures, and so on.
8 codes. Whoa, that's a lot to keep track of. I bet even seasoned officers need a refresher sometimes.
Oh, they do. They do receive extensive training. But remember, these codes aren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They're there to protect everyone.
Right.
Suspects aim at officers by ensuring fairness and due process.
Okay, so let's say the police suspect someone has committed a crime. When can they actually arrest them?
Well, the most common power of arrest comes from Section 24 of Pisaki,
Oh.
and an officer can arrest someone without a warrant if they suspect a crime has been committed and it's necessary to make the arrest.
Necessary meaning? Because that seems like it could be pretty subjective.
Well, it means there has to be a solid justification for taking away someone's freedom, right?
Yeah.
PACE Code G actually outlines what constitutes necessity.
Yeah.
It could be to confirm their identity, protect someone vulnerable, prevent injury, or stop the suspect from disappearing before questioning.
So it's not just about having a hunch. There are specific boxes that need to be ticked before someone can be deprived of their liberty.
Exactly. And beyond Section 24, there are other powers of arrest. So, for instance, executing warrants issued by courts, arresting for bail violations, breaches of court orders, and even a common law power to arrest for breaches of the peace.
Breach of the peace. Now, I feel like I've heard that term, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Yeah, it's a bit of a broad one, but it essentially covers any conduct that disrupts public order or creates a fear of violence.
Okay.
So, aggressive behavior, threats, damaging property, those could all lead to an arrest for breaching the peace, even if no specific crime has been committed.
Oh, okay. So there are quite a few ways someone could end up being arrested. What happens once they're in custody then?
That's where detention comes in. It allows for questioning and evidence gathering, but under PACE, there are strict time limits.
Okay, that makes sense. What are those time limits? Are they the same for every case?
So the initial detention period for most suspects is up to 24 hours.
Okay.
But for serious offenses, this can be extended with proper authorization,
Mm-hmm.
potentially for several days. But the idea is to handle things expeditiously.
Expeditiously, you lawyers and your fancy words.
Well, it just means they have to act quickly and release suspects as soon as it's appropriate to do so.
Okay, so what happens after the detention period then? What are the options at that point?
Well, there are a few. They could charge the suspect with a crime, release them under investigation while they gather more evidence,
Okay.
or release them on bail with conditions, things like reporting to the police regularly or not contacting certain people.
So even if they don't have enough to charge someone, they can still impose restrictions on their freedom?
They can, but those conditions are supposed to be proportionate to the situation and the suspected offense.
Right.
It's all about finding that balance again.
We've talked a lot about arrest and detention. What about another hot button issue? Stop and search.
Ah, yes, stop and search. This is a sensitive area
Yeah.
because it often sparks debates about public safety versus individual liberties. You know, it's frequently in the news and raises concerns about profiling and discrimination.
Yeah, I can see why that would be controversial. What are the different types of stop and search powers that UK police have?
Well, there are three main types. The most common is what we call the reasonable grounds search. It's based on Section 1 of PACE.
Okay.
And an officer must have a genuine reason to believe the person is carrying something prohibited.
Okay.
So a weapon, stolen goods, something that could be used for burglary, that sort of thing.
So it can't just be a random stop because someone looks out of place. There has to be something more concrete than that.
That's right. PACE Code A, again, provides guidance on what constitutes reasonable grounds.
All right.
Things like matching a suspect's description, acting suspiciously, or being in an area where a crime just happened.
What are the other types of stop and search powers then? I'm guessing they get even more controversial.
Well, the second type is what we call the no suspicion, or sometimes called the precondition search. And yes, this one is much more controversial. It allows officers to stop and search people even without individual suspicion.
Hold on. No suspicion at all. So they can just stop anyone randomly.
Not quite randomly. This type of search needs authorization from a senior officer and under very specific circumstances. So they have to believe that serious violence may occur in a particular area or that a violent incident already happened and that a weapon is still there.
So it's used in high-risk situations where they're trying to prevent violence or find a weapon.
Yes, but it's been heavily criticized for potentially leading to racial profiling and unfairly targeting certain groups.
Yeah,
It's a real balancing act
it is.
between preventing serious crime and respecting individual rights.
I can see how that one would be a tough call, especially for the officers on the ground, who have to make those judgment calls. What's the third type of stop search power then?
The third type is specifically for suspected terrorists.
Right.
It's governed by the Terrorism Act 2000. Officers can stop and search anyone they reasonably suspect of involvement in terrorism.
Okay.
Now, this one has even stricter safeguards than the others, and it's been the subject of many legal challenges.
It sounds like stop and search is a minefield
Mm.
with a lot of potential for things to go wrong if it's not handled carefully.
It definitely highlights the importance of clear guidelines, proper training, and robust accountability mechanisms.
Yeah. Speaking of potential overreach, let's talk about entering property, searching it, and seizing evidence. What are the rules around that? Can the police just barge into someone's home whenever they want?
Not at all, no. Part 2 of PACE is very clear.
Okay.
In most cases, they need a warrant from a court to enter and search private property. The sanctity of one's home is a big deal in English law.
Okay, so no warrant, no entry, unless.
Unless there's an immediate threat to life or risk of evidence being destroyed. In those exceptional circumstances, they can act without a warrant.
Okay.
But usually they have to convey a judge that there are reasonable grounds to believe evidence of a serious crime will be found on the property.
So even with a warrant, there are limitations, right? They can't just go on a fishing expedition.
Exactly. The warrant specifies what they're allowed to search for and where they can look.
Right.
They can seize items that they reasonably believe are evidence of a crime or that were illegally obtained.
Okay. Now, we've mentioned case law a couple of times. Can you explain what that is and why it matters in the context of police powers?
Sure. Case law is essentially a collection of past court decisions
Right.
that clarify the meaning of laws and set precedents for future cases. So it fills in the gaps and addresses any ambiguity in the legislation.
So it's not just about what the law says on paper, but how it's been interpreted and applied in real-life situations.
Exactly. And we have 2 great examples of this from the sources you provided.
Okay.
First, there's O'Hara v. Chief Constable of the RUC. It's a landmark case dealing with arrests related to terrorism.
Okay. Terrorism. That's a high-stakes situation.
Right.
What did the court decide in that case?
Well, O'Hara established a 2-pronged test for what constitutes reasonable suspicion in terrorism cases.
Okay.
The arresting officer must have a genuine suspicion that the person is involved in terrorism, and that suspicion must be objectively reasonable.
Okay.
It can't just be a gut feeling. It has to be based on something solid that would convince a reasonable person looking at the same information.
So even when fighting terrorism, there are still limits on police power.
Yeah.
They can't just arrest someone based on a hunch or vague suspicions.
That's right. And that leads us to the second case, Racy v. the Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis.
What happened in Racy? Did it involve terrorism as well?
Yes, this one involved someone who was arrested on suspicion of involvement in the September 11th attacks.
Right.
The arresting officer relied heavily on his superior's belief that the suspect was involved, even though he didn't have much direct knowledge of the evidence himself.
So he was basically just taking orders without really understanding the basis for the arrest.
That's essentially what happened, yes.
Right.
And the court in Racy made it very clear the arresting officer's suspicion has to be based on their own knowledge, their own assessment of the facts, not just blind faith in what their superiors tell them.
That's fascinating. So both of these cases really emphasize the need for individual accountability, even within a hierarchical system like law enforcement.
Precisely. Officers can't just blindly follow orders. They have a responsibility to exercise their judgment and make sure that their actions are legally and ethically justified.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
Indeed. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into the Proceeds of Crime Act
Okay.
and discuss the implications of these powers in a world that's constantly changing. So stay tuned.
Okay, I'm ready to keep diving deeper into this world of UK police powers. We were just talking about how court decisions shape the way these powers are actually used. What else can you tell me about that?
Well, that brings us to the Proceeds of Crime Act, usually just called POCA.
POCA, okay.
This legislation gives the police a way to target the financial side of criminal activity,
Go.
essentially going after the money.
So instead of just stopping crimes as they happen, they're trying to hit criminals where it hurts.
Right.
Their bank accounts.
Exactly. The idea is if criminals can't profit from their crimes, they might think twice before breaking the law. POCA lets police seize assets that are believed to be obtained through criminal activity,
Okay.
even if there hasn't been a conviction yet.
Wait, they can seize assets without a conviction? That doesn't seem very fair. How does that even work?
It's a process called civil recovery.
Okay.
So the police have to present evidence to a court showing that, more likely than not, those assets are the proceeds of crime.
Okay.
Think of it like a scale tipping slightly to one side. They have to show it's more probable than not that the assets are dirty money.
Ah, so it's a lower bar than in a criminal trial where they have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's right. It's still a legal process with safeguards, but it gives the police more leverage to disrupt criminal operations by cutting off their funding.
So what kind of assets are we talking about? Houses,
Yeah.
cars, stacks of cash hidden under the mattress.
Pretty much anything you can think of. Cash, property, vehicles, jewelry, investments, bank accounts, anything traceable back to criminal profits.
That's a pretty broad net they're casting. Are there any limits on what they can seize under POCA? What's stopping them from just taking anything they want?
There are definitely limits. The police have to act reasonably and proportionately, and the person whose assets are being seized can challenge the action in court.
Okay.
It's not a situation where they can just show up and take everything without a fight.
That's good to know. So there's a system of checks and balances in place to prevent abuse.
Exactly. POCA is a powerful tool, but it has to be used responsibly and fairly. And there's judicial oversight to make sure it's not being abused.
POCA sounds like a pretty effective way to disrupt criminal organizations, but I can imagine it being controversial. What are some of the criticisms leveled against it?
Well, some argue that it can be used to target people who haven't actually been convicted of a crime, which they see as a violation of due process.
Right.
Others worry about the potential for abuse, especially when it comes to seizing assets from people who might be involved in criminal activity but haven't directly profited from it.
So it's like that classic dilemma we've been talking about, trying to balance the need for security with the protection of individual rights.
Exactly, and POCA really highlights that tension. It's a powerful tool, but it needs to be used carefully and with proper oversight.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground with these more traditional police powers. But as you mentioned earlier, law enforcement is constantly evolving, right? What are some of the new challenges facing policing in the 21st century?
One of the biggest is the rise of cybercrime. Traditional methods often struggle to keep up with the fast-paced world of technology.
Yeah.
And the increasingly sophisticated tactics used by cybercriminals, it's a whole new playing field.
It's like the Wild West out there in cyberspace, right?
Yeah.
Anonymous hackers, data breaches, scams. It seems almost impossible to police effectively.
It's definitely a challenge. It requires international cooperation, technological innovation, and a willingness to adapt traditional methods to a digital environment.
What about something like artificial intelligence, AI, being used in policing? That seems like it could be both incredibly helpful and potentially problematic. What are your thoughts on that?
AI has the potential to revolutionize policing in many ways. Predicting crime hotspots using facial recognition,
Yeah.
analyzing vast amounts of data, even helping with investigations.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But what about the potential downsides? We've all seen those sci-fi movies where AI takes over and things go very wrong.
Well, those are just movies.
Right.
But there are legitimate concerns about AI in policing.
Yeah.
How do we make sure these systems are used fairly and responsibly?
Mm-hmm.
How do we prevent bias from creeping into algorithms, especially when they're being used to make decisions that affect people's lives?
Bias in algorithms. Now, that's something I hadn't considered. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Sure. Algorithms are only as good as the data they're trained on.
Right.
If that data reflects existing biases in society, then those biases can be amplified by the AI system.
So if an algorithm is trained on data that shows, for example, a disproportionate number of arrests in a certain neighborhood, it might unfairly flag people from that neighborhood as higher risk, even if they've done nothing wrong.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to have transparency and oversight when it comes to AI and policing.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make sure these systems are being used ethically, and that there are mechanisms in place to address any biases or unfair outcomes.
This AI stuff is really making my head spin.
Yeah.
But I can see how it has the potential to change policing in a big way, both for better and for worse.
Absolutely.
What other challenges do you see on the horizon for law enforcement?
Well, the use of force by police, particularly against marginalized communities, continues to be a major concern.
Yeah.
We need to address the systemic issues that contribute to these tragedies
Right.
and build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
I couldn't agree more. How do we even begin to tackle a problem as complex as that?
Well, it's going to require a multifaceted approach. We need to address implicit bias in policing, improve training, promote diversity within police forces,
Right.
and strengthen community oversight.
Accountability seems to be a recurring theme here.
It is.
whether it's making sure algorithms are fair, preventing abuse of power, or holding officers accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
It all comes down to making sure the system is working as it should.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for citizens to be informed,
Yeah.
engaged, and willing to ask tough questions about how policing is done in their communities.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. It's clear that policing is facing a lot of challenges in the 21st century,
It is.
but it's also clear that there are people working hard to address those challenges and find solutions.
That's the important takeaway here. Policing is constantly evolving, and it's up to all of us to make sure it evolves in a way that protects both our safety and our freedom.
This deep dive has been, I don't know about you, but for me at least, really eye-opening.
Oh.
We've explored this intricate web of UK police powers, the legal frameworks, the safeguards, and even the challenges facing modern policing. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and I think it's a testament to how, law enforcement has to constantly adapt to societal changes, new technologies, and that ongoing conversation around, well, security and freedom, right?
And, one thing that really struck me is how these powers aren't just set in stone, are they?
No.
They're constantly being debated and challenged and refined through case law, new legislation, public discourse.
That's crucial, yeah. Law enforcement isn't static. It requires constant evolution to, stay effective and to maintain that, I guess, that delicate balance between protecting the public and upholding individual liberties.
It's like what we were discussing earlier about cybercrime and AI and policing. These are real game changers, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
And they demand new approaches, a whole new way of thinking about law enforcement.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for, citizens to stay informed, stay engaged. We need to ask those tough questions. We need to understand the implications of these new technologies, and we need to make sure that accountability remains at the forefront.
It feels like a call to action
Yeah,
for all of us.
it is.
We can't just sit back and assume everything will sort itself out, can we? We need to understand our rights, hold those in power accountable, and actively participate in shaping the future of policing in our communities.
Couldn't agree more. The future of policing really does depend on an informed and engaged public. We need to be active participants in building a society where security and freedom, well, they reinforce each other, not come at each other's expense.
So for our listener who's been on this journey with us today, what's that one key takeaway that you want them to remember?
I would say this: knowledge is power. Understanding these complex police powers, the laws that govern them, and the safeguards that are in place, well, it empowers us all. It helps us navigate our interactions with law enforcement, advocate for fair practices, and contribute to a society where security and liberty can, well, they can coexist.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible deep dive. I know I've learned a ton, and I hope our listener has too.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, the pursuit of knowledge is a journey best taken together.
And to our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics. There are great resources out there. The College of Policing website, legal databases, even your local library. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.